presentation, we're going to be focusing on communication skills. Into communication specifically, I wanted to take a second to explain why we're focusing on these professional skills. Employers look highly on candidates that have professional skills. Obviously, you need to have the necessary technical skills to do the job, but employers value professional skills just as much. It's important to be able to do the technical side, but it's also important to be able to communicate with people on your team, people who are using your product, or anyone outside the industry, and it's also helpful to be skilled in problem solving, critical thinking, and working with the team. All those skills are important and will benefit you in the workplace. I did want to highlight a study from NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers. They did a study where they reached out to new graduates and employers and asked them how important they considered these competencies or skills in employment, and asked them how proficient they believe new graduates are with each of these skills. If you look at these numbers, you'll start to notice a pattern. For the most part, both new graduates and employers valued these skills similarly and said they believed they were important. But if you look at how they judged the proficiency of new graduates in those skills, new graduates believed they were much more proficient than how the employers ranked them. So, even if you think you're amazing at any or all of these categories, there is always room to improve, and it's always worthwhile to get some feedback and practice. It can help you in the long run. These are the topics we're going to be covering in the presentation today. First, knowing your audience, focusing on tone and word choice, nonverbal communication, written and verbal communication, and active listening. First, it's always important to consider who your audience is when you're communicating with them. No matter what type of communication you're doing, it's essential to consider this because it really does impact every aspect of your communication. So, think about audience for a second. Reflect on what that means to you. What comes to mind and what concepts do you think about? Hopefully some of these came to mind, but these are some specific things you need to think about when you're communicating. So first, think about what's their role or their relationship to you or with the company. So obviously when you're communicating with your supervisor, that's a different relationship than if you're talking to a customer or someone you work with closely every single day. So you want to reflect on that and consider how that impacts your relationship. Next, you want to think, what is this person's priorities? What do they care about, and how can you relate that to what you're communicating? So if you're talking to a customer, you want to make sure that you're supporting them and you're meeting their needs. You're providing something, and so you want to make sure that you're professional and you have that aspect to you. If you're talking to your supervisor, they want someone who's a good employee, and they're prioritizing effectiveness and those types of things. So you're going to communicate in different ways there as well. Along with that, think about what their expectations are. If you're talking to a customer, their expectation is that you're there to support them and that you're going to be respectful and all those things, and probably a little bit more formal. With your close peer, if you talk the same way you talk to a customer, they might look a little confused. So think about their expectations, but also think about your own expectations. Often they'll be aligned, but it's important to consider when you're communicating with anyone. You want to pay attention to is context. This is essential in any communication because the context impacts how people relate to and how people approach what you're saying. So, to give a little perspective on context, I wanted to start with this quick picture. If you look, these are three people who don't have any concept of what an elephant is, and all three of these people are blind. So, they're each trying to gain an understanding of what an elephant is through touch alone. The one on the left is near the trunk and notices that it's long, cylindrical, and bends. So they conclude an elephant is like a snake. The person in the middle is probably thinking that person has no idea what they're talking about because they feel a large, broad surface that feels like a wall. The person on the right is probably wondering what both of them are talking about. They feel something like a rope. It's long and knotted at the end. All three of them are right, but because they're only considering their own perspective, they're missing out on the larger context. The same is true when you're communicating with others. So, when you think about context, I recommend focusing on these things. First, have you communicated with them before? If this is your first time interacting with them, you want to make sure that you're communicating in a polite and respectful way so you can make a good impression. But if you have communicated with them before, consider how that interaction went. That can impact how you approach them in the future. The next thing you want to think about is, what is the situation? Is this a more formal or informal context? Depending on the context, what you say could be completely acceptable or completely inappropriate. For example, if you casually ask a coworker to give you a file in the middle of a high-stakes meeting, this will not go over well. But if you casually ask that same question when you're talking during a slow part of the day, they're much more likely to help. You also want to pay attention to what's going on around you. Is everyone in the office stressed and focusing to meet a looming deadline? If so, that's not the time to start a casual conversation about your plans for the weekend. Or, if it's the very beginning of the day and everyone's slowly getting settled and getting coffee, that's probably not the best time to start asking long, detailed questions about a project. That could cause some stress and frustration with your coworkers. Consider how you're communicating. Depending on the method, there are different norms and expectations. Make sure you're approaching people in a way they're expecting and feel comfortable with. As you think about context, it can be helpful to incorporate empathy. This can help you recognize patterns or situations you wouldn't notice otherwise. Speaking of empathy, this is a good time to go into more detail about how to use empathy in communication. Pay attention to the people around you. Often you can gain an understanding about what they might be thinking or feeling, which can help you know how to communicate with them better. Here are some tips on how to do that. Notice their body language. Often that can give you a clue to how they may be feeling. For example, if someone is avoiding eye contact and folding their arms, their body language suggests they could be uncomfortable or are closing themselves off from the situation. If a person is speaking animatedly and is making broad gestures, you could infer that they're confident or excited about what they're talking about. One strategy to empathize with someone is to imagine what you would feel or what you would think if you were experiencing what that person was experiencing. It's likely that they may feel something similar. This can also give you an idea about what kinds of things would be helpful for the person and what they might appreciate. It's important to remember that not everyone is like you, but using this strategy combined with others can help you determine if you're on the right track. Reflect on what you know about their perspective and experience. This can help you consider how they may approach a situation. For example, if you were talking to someone who didn't have a technical background, how do you think they would react if you started talking about complicated technical concepts? Likely, they may feel overwhelmed or lost. They could simply zone out because they don't understand. But if you adjust your communication strategy and simplify your description of concepts and compare it to something they're familiar with, they're much more likely to understand and enjoy the interaction. Move on to tone and word choice. Take a second to think about what this means to you. Here are some things to be aware of when you're focusing on tone and word choice. Your tone is extremely important. It has a profound impact on what you're saying. Using the wrong tone could completely derail what you're trying to say. Tone can be demonstrated both vocally and in written communication. Vocal tone is communicated through vocal pitch, inflections, and also nonverbal communication. In writing, tone is shown through your word choice, phrasing, and punctuation. For example, if you're ending every sentence with an exclamation point, it could seem like you're shouting. Also, it's important to remember, if you're communicating in a business setting, you should use emojis very sparingly. They imply a familiar, casual, and an informal tone, so make sure that the situation you're considering using them in matches that kind of tone. Words can also have a profound impact on your communication. Often words with similar meanings can have drastically different connotations and implications. For example, these word pairings each mean something similar, but some have a more positive connotation, while others are more negative. Another thing to consider about word choice. In addition to connotation, different people may have slightly different perceptions or understandings of words depending on their experience. For example, let's look at the word conflict. When I think of this word, my first thought is about stress and tension. But here's a word cloud of other concepts people may consider. Someone else may think of drama, noise, anger, or fighting. All are related to conflict. Here's another example. Need. These answers were given by an audience of college students. Consider how this list might change if you were talking to a child or a CEO. You'd probably have a very different list for both of those audiences. Let's look at one last word. Honor. All of these words relate highly to personal values, so it's best not to throw this word around casually. When you're choosing words, give extra attention to context and consider your audience perspective. That can help you ensure that you're communicating what you're intending to. We're going to focus on specific types of communication. First, let's look at verbal and written communication. These methods of communication have some important commonalities. For both of these ways of communicating, it's important to have a kind of greeting or send-off. Without that, your communication can seem abrupt or rude. It's also generally a good idea in professional situations to avoid using poor grammar, casual slang, or swearing. It's a good idea to maintain a positive attitude in your communication. You want your interactions to be respectful and uplifting, so you want to avoid putting others down. Also, in any type of communication, it's good practice to be respectful of the other person's time. In practice, doing these things can look different when you're communicating verbally or through in writing. Let's look at verbal communication first. For verbal communication, a greeting could be saying hi or good morning, and could include a simple wave or knock on the door. Similarly, when you're ending a conversation, you should try to say bye or give some indication that you're moving on. Keeping a positive attitude verbally means you should try to keep your interactions positive. One way this can quickly derail is through gossip and office politics. It's a good idea to avoid engaging in these practices. It will help you have a more positive interaction with everyone on your team and can speak to your professionalism. When you're talking to someone, you can be respectful of their time by considering context. If someone is busy, you could come back at a different time. It's also a good idea to be brief. You don't want to monopolize someone's time or assume they want to talk right now just because you do. Now, let's look at written communication. Your greeting could be a line before you jump into your main content. This could be a good morning or a dear Mr. and Mrs. whoever. In less formal emails, such as if you're emailing a colleague or you're working closely with someone, your greeting could be a simple hi or good morning. Since written communication is visual and allows you to edit before you send it to someone, it's important to proofread your writing before you send it. If you don't, this could make you sound unprofessional, disrespectful, or sloppy. Another good practice in written communication is to keep your message concise. Try to make your writing easy to read. Consider splitting up your ideas into different paragraphs or lists to make it more accessible to whoever's reading it. It's also important that you don't expect a response immediately after you send a message. A good rule of thumb is to wait about 24 business day hours for a response. About nonverbal communication. Think about what comes to mind. Here are some important aspects of nonverbal communication to consider. Pay attention to facial expressions, particularly their eyebrows, eyes, mouth, and wrinkles near their eyes or nose. These can be a strong indicator of feelings. For example, look at these pictures. Each one conveys a very different emotion. Another thing to pay attention to is body language and posture. How people carry themselves can be a strong indicator on their feelings and their attitude. Look at this picture. Which one of these would you describe as confident? What is it about their body language that makes you think that? I would say probably the person in the middle or the person to his left. Both of them are looking up slightly, are standing upright with their shoulders pushed back, and are making confident gestures with their hands. Compare that to the man on the far right. He's looking down and his shoulders are hunched. In comparison to the other two men, he looks much less confident. Consider how a person is talking. Vocal tone, volume, inflection, pitch, and speed can add a lot of depth to what's being communicated. For example, if someone is speaking loudly and very quickly, they're probably feeling a strong emotion. Listening to their vocal tone and inflections can give you a clue about what that emotion might be. Nonverbal communication also involves physical space. Your proximity to someone is impacted by context and your type of relationship with the person. This diagram is a good guide when you're thinking about personal space. Take a second to review the diagram and reflect on your own experience. Everyone's concept of personal space is different, but these guidelines are pretty typical. If you're trying to gauge what is an appropriate amount of space, pay attention to the person's body language and facial expressions. If they seem uncomfortable, nervous, or are backing away, you may be too close. If they are craning their necks and leaning in so they can try to hear better, it could be appropriate to come a bit closer. Your appearance is an aspect of nonverbal communication. Pay attention to what clothes you choose to wear and make sure that you're taking good care of your personal hygiene. In the workplace, you should always try to look put together and be well-groomed, wear professional clothes, and avoid strong scents like strong perfumes, colognes, or body odor. Look at these examples. Based on their appearance, it's likely you'd consider the people on the right to be more professional and prepared than the people on the left. Example of how nonverbal communication can affect meaning. For each of these examples, we're going to use this same phrase. Look at these first people. They might say this phrase as, "That was really helpful." Their body language and soft and sincere vocal tone suggest they're familiar and comfortable with each other. Now, let's look at these people. They might say this phrase as, that was really helpful. You can tell from my tone they seem uncertain or uncomfortable. Their body language, particularly their hands and facial expressions, also give that impression. And finally, let's look at this last example. They might say this phrase as, "That was really helpful." Their tone is more aggressive, and their body language also suggests a conflict or feelings of anger. Remember that we got all of that information just from how those words were said and how people were carrying themselves. Nonverbal communication is a powerful indicator, so it's essential to pay attention to it when you're communicating with others. Here are a few other things to keep in mind with nonverbal communication. First, pay attention to implied or non-literal meanings. Most often, this comes in the form of subtext or sarcasm. The best way to identify implied or non-literal meanings is to pay attention to context. If a person's nonverbal communication doesn't match what they're saying or doesn't seem congruent with the situation, that's a good clue that there is an underlying meaning. A good example of this is if someone says, "It's fine," during a disagreement. Most likely, they don't mean everything's fine. It's also important to consider social norms. These can be cultural norms, but can also be specific for a smaller group. Try to pay attention to manners and customs of people around you and gauge what is appropriate. For example, if you were in a training and the instructor told you to ask any question that crosses your mind, it's most likely they don't mean any question. They probably mean any question that relates to the topic or skills being taught. If you find yourself working in a different area or culture, make an effort to learn common sayings, gestures, and meanings. You don't want to accidentally insult someone. The thing I want to focus on in this presentation is about listening. Being able to listen and communicate that you're listening is essential to any conversation. A great way to do this is called active listening. Here are some ways to be an active listener. Pay attention to what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally. Focus on trying to understand what they're saying, not what you want to say in response. Every once in a while, paraphrase or restate what they're saying so you can confirm and communicate your understanding. When you do this, it's important to make sure you're not just mindlessly repeating what they said. This can come across as insincere. Ask for clarifying or missing information. This can help make sure you're understanding them fully and communicates to the person that you're trying to understand. However, make sure you're not asking something that they have already talked about. That communicates that you weren't listening. Another thing you can do as an active listener is provide minimal encouragers. These are small gestures or vocal indications that you're listening and invested in the conversation. Nodding occasionally, making eye contact, or saying, "mm-hmm," or "wow," are some examples of minimal encouragers. You can also add some small verbal statements related to the conversation. These statements aren't meant to shift the attention to you, but are meant to show you're connecting with what's being talked about. Be mindful of your tone when you're using minimal encouragers to ensure you don't accidentally give off an implied meaning you don't intend to. When you're listening, try to empathize with the person. This can help you as you try to understand what they're saying. You can incorporate your inferences as you paraphrase to confirm that you're understanding them accurately. And last, avoid interrupting the person or having a judgmental attitude. Try to be open-minded and give the other person a chance and time to speak. Use your silence purposefully.